In our course, we have already touched on the primitive data types. However, those are not all data types that JavaScript lets us work with. Another one there is called objects. Objects are used to store collections of values or more complex entities. In JavaScript, we use objects very often, and we should probably understand them very well before digging much deeper. To create an object in JavaScript, we use curly brackets. Objects have something called properties. A property is a key-value pair, where key, or as it is also called a property name, is a string. And value can be anything. It can be another string, function, or even another object. You can think of an object as a dictionary, where to get the translation of any value, you need to know its key. By the key, you can retrieve, update, or delete the value. Let's see how we can create an empty object or dictionary. There are a couple of ways in JavaScript to do that. So I will say let user. And one way to create an object is using the constructor function by calling new object. Another way is using curly brackets. I'm going to say let user, curly brackets. Both of these notations create an empty object and assign them to the variable user. This second one is a more common notation, so I'm just going to get rid of this first one. When using this syntax, we can on the spot put a few key value pairs into our object. Every property has its own identifier, the key. So I'm just going to say let user equal curly bracket name, which is going to be John, and age 30. So to add a property in the object, we start with the property name over here, then goes the semicolon, and then follows the property value. Properties or key value pairs in the object are separated with a comma, and leaving this trailing comma over here is just a common way to make it more convenient for adding more properties into our object. So in this case, our object has two properties. We can also say that we have a dictionary with two properties. Now to access values in our object, we can use a dot notation. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to say console log, just to spit out the value, and I'll say user dot name. Save and let's see. John. Perfect. So using this dot notation, we can get a hold of our properties, of our values in the object. Using this same dot notation, we can also add properties into our object. This way I can say user is admin, true. This will add another key into our user object, and it will assign the true value into that key. Let's just make sure this works. Another console log, user is admin, and the output is true. To delete a property, we can use a delete operator. Same way as I added this property into our user object, I can just say delete user is admin, and let's try to output it after we delete it. Let's see what we get. Refresh. We get the true the first time we added this property, and then the second time we try to log it, we get undefined. Perfect, it works as expected. Property name can be comprised of two words. Although in that case, you need to place it in quotes like so. Let me show you. User has login, true. Although this is a not very common way to add properties in our object, and I wouldn't recommend you doing that. I'm just showing this to you to explain the functionality. I'm gonna take it out, save. There is another way to access values in our object. We can use square brackets for that too. Let me show you. I'm gonna get rid of this output, and I will say console log again. and I'll say user square bracket name. Let's see what this gives us. Refresh. John. This is an identical approach to how we previously accessed the value, but we get one big advantage with this. Now the keys can be calculated values. So if somewhere above I were to calculate what the name should be, let's say I have some calculation, I'm going to declare a variable that will represent that calculation. I will call it calculated name. And that will be a string name. Now I can use this variable in my square brackets to get a hold of that property in the object. So what this will do is it will grab the value inside that variable, pass it in the square brackets, and it will say, okay, give me the property from this object that matches the string value that lives in that variable. This is all that notation is doing. This actually gives us quite a bit of flexibility when building our logic. We can also use square brackets in literal notation to create a calculated property name. Let me show you. I'm gonna place this above our user object declaration. And I can say over here, square brackets, calculated name. The gist of it is the same as before. All it means is that we need to use the string from the variable as a key for a value in our object. So it says grab the name, make it a property name over here, and assign John to that name. Now our output shouldn't change, since in our user object we have the name property, which contains the string John. Let's see if it works. John. And just to make it a little clearer, I'm gonna output an entire object. I'll say console log user, and let's see the output. See how in our object there is a name property, not the calculated name, but rather the name, which is the value in that variable. Let me show you a real-life example of where objects and functions from our previous topic come together. Let's say in our program we're going to be creating multiple users many times, and I do not want to rewrite the object notation all the time. Does it ring the bell yet? Functions is what we are interested in. Let's write a function that will be building users for us. So I'm gonna get rid of this, and probably just everything start fresh. I'm gonna say function make user, and it will be taking two parameters, name and age. And right here, my function will be creating a user, which is going to be an object that will have a name property that will contain a value of a name parameter over here. Same thing goes for age. Age will be our property name that will take a value of the age parameter here. Semicolon, and I will just return this user. Let's put it to use. Let's say let user1 make user with name Chris and age 25, and user2 with name Bob and age 30. And I'll just log those two users and see the output. Perfect. User1 Chris, age 25, user2 Bob, age 30. Now we can build users without repeating ourselves. There exists a principle in programming called DRY, which is an abbreviation for don't repeat yourself. And this is exactly what we are able to achieve here. So one big difference between JavaScript and some other programming languages is that in JavaScript you can get access to any property of an object. There will be no error even if it doesn't exist. Let me show you what I mean. I can say console log user1 dot whatever. Whatever is a property that doesn't exist in the user, and we've seen this before. It will be undefined. So when trying to access that property that doesn't exist, you get undefined. However, sometimes we need to check if property is present in the object. For that, in JavaScript, there exists an in operator, and here's how you use it. I can say if whatever is in user1, then log user1 whatever. And maybe otherwise, just log username. Let's see what this gives us. And we get the username because whatever property does not exist in that object. Let's add it. Let's say user1 dot whatever equals something, and see the output. And we get the something. And last but not the least object functionality I want to talk about today is the iteration over object properties. For iteration over all properties of an object, there exists a for-in loop. Let's see an example. Let's maybe extend our function a little bit. Let's say is admin will be false by default, and say likes birds true by default. So we have a function that builds a user with such properties. And I'll create one. John, 30-year-old. So to iterate over all properties of the user, I can say for key in user. So what this will do is it will create a variable key that on every iteration step will have the property name of each property in my object. So I should be able to say console log user add the key. And that will iterate over all properties in our object. Let's see if it works. Slight correction here, we forgot to declare it as a variable. We need this as a variable, so let key in user, refresh, and it does work. John, 30-year-old, false and true. It is important to remember that object is an unordered data structure. What it means is that keys are not going to be sorted in any way. It is just a key value storage, and when building your logic or iterating over object, you shouldn't make assumptions that keys will be presented to you in a particular sequence. That is not the case here. That's all I have for objects for now, and see you in the next video. Helpful links, as always, will be in the video description.